Audio Jungle.
Welcome, this is Climate Change News with me, Siva Olfiani. For 2 weeks, the world was into climate change, discussing the science, solution, the political will to act, and clear indications of action. The UN Climate Change Conference in Glasgow brought together 120 world leaders and over 40,000 registered participants. These include more than 22,000 party delegates, 14,000 observers, and almost 4,000 media representatives. The COP26 produced the Glasgow Climate Pact, which is the result of negotiation among almost 200 countries over 2 weeks, work over many months, and engagement for nearly 2 years. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said that the approved texts are compromise. They reflect the interest, the condition, the contradictions, and the state of political will in the world today. They take important steps, but unfortunately, the collective political will was not enough to overcome some deep contradictions. Cuts in global greenhouse gas emissions are still far from where they need to preserve a livable climate. Besides, support for the most vulnerable countries affected by the impacts of climate change is still falling far short. However, COP26 did produce new building blocks to advance the implementation of Paris Agreement through action that can get the world on a more sustainable, low-carbon pathway forward. The conference investigated several agreements in recognizing the emergency, accelerating action, moving away from fossil fuels, delivering on climate finance, stepping up support for adaptation, completing for Paris Rulebook, focusing on loss and damage, and also new deals and announcements. Countries reaffirmed the Paris Agreement goal of limiting the increase in the global average temperature to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial level and pursuing efforts to limit it to 1.5 degrees Celsius. They went further by expressing the alarm and utmost concern that human activities have caused around 1.1 degrees Celsius of warming to date. Its impacts are already being felt in every region, and its carbon budgets consistent with achieving the Paris Agreement temperature goal are now small and being rapidly depleted. They recognize that the impact of climate change will be much lower at a temperature increase of 1.5 degrees Celsius compared with 2 degrees Celsius. Countries stressed the urgency of action in this critical decade when carbon dioxide emissions must be reduced by 45% to reach net zero around mid-century. But with present climate plans based on the nationally determined contributions that are falling far short on ambition, the Glasgow Climate Pact calls on all countries to present stronger national action plans next year, instead of in 2025, which was the original timeline. Countries also called on UNFCCC to do an annual energy synthesis report to gauge the present level of ambition. In perhaps the most contested decision in Glasgow, countries ultimately agreed to a provision calling for a phase down of coal power and a phase out on inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. These are two key issues that had never been explicitly mentioned in decisions of UN climate talks before, despite coal, oil, and gas being the main drivers of global warming. Many countries and NGOs expressed dissatisfaction that the language on coal was significantly weakened and consequently was not as ambitious as it needs to be. Developed countries came to Glasgow, falling short on their promised to deliver 100 billion US dollar a year for developing countries. Voicing regret, the Glasgow outcome reaffirms the pledge and urged developed countries to fully deliver 100 billion US dollar goal urgently. Developed countries, in a report, expressed confidence that the target would be met in 2023. The Glasgow Pact calls for a doubling of finance to support developing countries in adapting to the impacts of climate change and building resilience. This won't provide all the funding that poorer countries need, but it would significantly increase finance for protecting lives and livelihoods, which so far made up only about 25% of all climate finance, with 75% going toward green technologies to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions. Glasgow also established a work program to define a global goal on adaptation, which will identify collective needs and solutions to climate crisis already affecting many countries. Countries reached an agreement on the remaining issues of the so-called Paris Rulebook, the operational details for the practical implementation of the Paris Agreement. Among them are the norms related to the carbon markets, which will allow countries struggling to meet their emissions target to purchase emission reductions from other nations that have already exceeded their targets. Negotiations were also concluded on an enhanced transparency framework. It includes providing for common time frames and agreed formats for countries to regularly report on progress. The design to build trust and confidence that all countries are contributing their share to the global effort. Acknowledging that climate change is having increasing impacts on people, especially in the developing world, countries agreed to strengthen a network called the San Diego Network that connects vulnerable countries with providers of technical assistance, knowledge, and resources to address climate risks. They also launched a new Glasgow Dialogue to discuss arrangements for the funding of activities to avert, minimize, and address loss and damage associated with the adverse effects of climate change. There were many other significant deals and announcements outside of the Glasgow Climate Pact which can have major positive impacts if they are indeed implemented. These include forests, methane, cars, coal, and private finance. 137 countries took a landmark step forward by committing to halt and reverse forest loss and land degradation by 2030. The pledge is backed by $12 billion in public and $7.2 billion in private funding. In addition, CEOs from more than 30 financial institutions with over $8.7 trillion of global assets committed to eliminating investment in activities linked to deforestation. 103 countries, including 15 major emitters, signed up to the Global Methane Pledge, which aims to limit methane emissions by 30% by 2030 compared to 2020 levels. Methane, one of the most potent greenhouse gases, is responsible for a third of current warming from human activities. Over 30 countries, 6 major vehicle manufacturers, and other actors like cities set out their determination for all new car and van sales to be zero-emission vehicles by 2040 globally and 2035 in leading markets. It accelerates the decarbonization of road transport, which currently accounts for about 10% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Leaders from South Africa, the United Kingdom, the United States, France, Germany, and the European Union announced a groundbreaking partnership to support South Africa. is the country in the world's most carbon-intensive electricity producer with $8.5 billion over the next 3 to 5 years to make a just transition away from coal to a low-carbon economy. Private financial institutions and central banks announced moves to realign trillions of dollars toward achieving global net zero emissions. Among them is the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, with over 450 firms across 45 countries that control $130 trillion in assets, requiring its members to set robust, science-based near-term targets. Well, that's all for this week's climate change news. Good morning and see you.